There's a river somewhere.
So much needs fixing around the globe.
Do you draw the line
and next door?
You and I, all that's broken on the river.
It is time for We Act Radio's Conversations Toward Repair. Welcome. This is We Act Radio, broadcasting from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C., land that was once home to Nacotchtank people, sometimes called Anacostan, who were displaced within about 40 years of Europeans arriving. Anacostia again faces displacement as new, more upmarket building takes the place of long-standing residents and businesses. And displacement is just one form of structural violence considered in this series, Conversations Toward Repair. I am Virginia Avniel Spatz, and my intention in this series has been to focus on undoing violence by exploring many forms of violence embedded in our city, nation, globe that frequently go unremarked, and highlighting ways that we can build community and peace. My guest this morning is Brandon Johnson, founder and executive director of Oakland-based national organization Rahim. Before we begin our conversation, I do want to note 3 facts related to our discussion that are weighing on our local community. Timothy McCree Johnson, known as Timothy, a DC man, was killed by Fairfax County Police outside Tyson's Corner Shopping Mall in Fairfax on February 22nd. On Monday, in DC, Savonte Dodie Perkins died from what police and a nearby witness say was a self-inflicted gunshot following exchange of gunfire with DC's Metropolitan Police. And yesterday, U.S. Marshals killed a man, so far unidentified publicly, except to say that he was in his 20s. Law enforcement reports that they were trying to serve an arrest warrant when the man produced a weapon and the 2 marshals fired on him. I'll provide more information later in the show about these cases. For now, I mention them because I think it's important to talk about a few individuals before we begin a more general conversation. Our local community continues to mourn so many recent deaths of Black men and boys killed by law enforcement, or in one case, a vigilante. And of course, DC is not alone in this. I just think it's important that we make sure to not let the individuals and the family and friends and communities left behind to mourn get lost in data and hashtags. So I just begin by recognizing Timmy Johnson, Savonte Dodie Perkins, and the as yet unidentified young man killed yesterday. So this brings us to the work of envisioning a better future, and that's where my guest comes in. And so with that, I will actually really welcome Brandon Anderson from who, as I said, is the founder and director of the organization. It's a national organization called Rahim, and it's based in Oakland. And anything else you would like our audience to know?
That sounds about good.
Okay. All right. So actually, I'm going to start with a question that I didn't previously prepare, but I've been curious. Is Rahim named for Radio Rahim, or like where did Rahim come from?
No, it's not. It's not named after Radio Rahim, but it is named. Rahim is an Arabic term meaning compassion and a second chance, and it's named after my partner who was killed in 2007 during a routine traffic stop.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I was thinking it was based on that fictional character, which is bad enough, but
yeah.
Well, I am both sorry to hear that and glad that the work can go on to try to improve the situation. So I advertised this show as discussing infrastructure, and I wanted to talk about 2 different kinds of infrastructure that I think, if I understand correctly, Rahim deals with. One is the kind of technological thing, the reporting mechanism, and the other is the kind of organizing, which I think is another form of infrastructure. You want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it's important first to talk about the problem we hope to solve and the problem that we're facing. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of Raheem and how we landed at this place. So I founded Raheem in 2017, and in 2017 we started as the nation's first and only independent online police reporting service. We collected thousands of reports across about 200 cities that documented community members' honest experiences with police violence. And that work highlighted that police do not provide care to people in crisis. Instead, they escalate situations and endanger people in need, but especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous community members. And as a result, we have found that during that 4 years of documenting the experiences of police, that requesting and receiving critical care during crises is inaccessible to the people who need it most. And so our solution, we sunsetted the reporting service in 2021 and have since been incubating community crisis care teams by providing them with tools, trainings, and connections. Community crisis response team, or community crisis response, is a compassionate, culturally competent care delivered to people in need by unarmed community members who've been trained to help. And groups of people who coordinate these responses are called community crisis response teams, CCRTs. And community crisis response is a powerful, proven, and local solution emerging across the country as people are meeting the urgent needs of their neighbors without involving the police. And we want to nurture this new world being built. And so our work looks like, again, we provide tools, trainings, and connections that CCRTs, community crisis response teams, need across the country. And so we do this in a couple of ways. First, we do this through, in terms of tools, we're the developers of the Patch mobile app. It's like mission control for community crisis care, right? It's the Patch app, it helps organizations coordinate and deliver care. We also, we've designed it to solve the major problems that CCRT leaders have told us they face, which are dispatching personnel, communicating securely, and then being able to analyze response data, right? And then we are, also we convene the Patch Network, which is an unprecedented nationwide network of mobile crisis teams, health and social services, and abolitionist organizations that are either managing or interested in establishing community crisis response teams. Today, the network includes about 62 organizations across the country, 3 of those being national orgs, in about 19 states across the country.
So the reporting portal that you had, it operated for, I guess, 4 years, right?
4 years. Mm-hmm.
And I've looked at some of the responses, and there are a lot of important stories in there, but there's certainly a lot that wasn't reported. And I know that one of the reasons that it was founded was because people are afraid to report, and the systems that are in place to report abuse by police just don't work. So do you have any sense of, I don't know, what percentage of incidents you were able to gather? I mean, thousands is, each one is bad and thousands is bad, but it must be only tip of the iceberg.
Oh, it's certainly just the tip of the iceberg. When I founded Raheem in 2017, you're right. We founded it as the nation's first independent service for reporting police, primarily because police required you to file a complaint before Raheem existed. Most cities in the country required you to file a complaint in person during business hours and within 90 days of your incident or the incident that took place. And as a result, we actually saw that 95% of the time, in fact, those experiences went unreported. That's a little higher due to the work we had done for 4 years. But generally speaking, that number is a difficult number to increase, primarily because of the efficacy of violence on behalf of police officers in a city that provide all sorts of violence, procedural neglect, that physical and verbal abuse, police brutality, psychological, economic exploitation. I mean, it runs the gamut. Again, we ran this in 200 cities. We had 200 active cities at the time of at the time we sunset this project. And again, what it taught us is that the concerns of community members and the reasons why community members were calling police and what police had been trained to provide was a mismatch for 4 years. And so as a result, what we had found is, during our reporting service, we were known for two things. The first 4 years, we helped people, we were known for helping you file a formal complaint that connected you with a free lawyer and then united you with a local organizing group, because complaining about a police officer, strength is in the numbers. And then secondly, as a result, and by design, those reports helped us build this massive database on how police performed in local communities through the experiences and words of real people, right? And so again, after thousands of people had documented in one question we had asked is, why did you call 911? For what reason did you dial the number, and why did you need help? Again, most of the concerns that people had made were things that community members could not rely on police to deliver, like delivering mental health care, de-escalating sensitive family conflicts, or sort of supporting individuals who navigate homeless, who are living, without a home. Again, these are structural concerns that police are certainly not trained to do, but given that they are trained for 9 months to perform activities that mostly include acts of violence, like shooting center mass, using force and manipulation to maneuver bodies, to take control over situations. These are not the sort of things that police officers are trained to do. And so as family members and as community members were depending on police to respond to their very real concerns that are a result of structural violence in their cities, they are then also on top of that met with immediate violence in the face of police arriving on the scene. And as a result of that, we sunsetted the reporting service because we found that several communities across the country were creating alternatives that didn't depend on police at all. And we want to nurture this world. We want to support and be a capacity builder for organizations. And at that time, we found about 3. And now, again, we have a network of over 60 organizations that are either managing or establishing or interested in establishing community crisis response teams. Again, because they are the ones that are capable of responding to crises, because safety is rooted in relationship and care, and cops have neither in our communities.
So I want to remind listeners that you're listening to We Act Radio from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C. That was the voice of Brandon Anderson. And I see that in my notes, somehow I miscopied his name. So if I said a different name out loud, I want to apologize and make sure everybody knows you're listening to Brandon Anderson of the organization Rahim. And I don't know where my head was.
Oh, thank you.
So I apologize for whatever. I'm not sure what I said out loud, but I see in my notes it's wrong. So anyway, Brandon Anderson of Rahim, which is based in Oakland but works nationally, and as you heard, has organizations it's working to support that are trying to create a reality that doesn't an abolitionist reality would not have police at all, but that doesn't focus on police as the response for our many things that ail us and for individual situations that are going wrong. And I wanted to ask about if you have examples in the organizations that you're working with or national work that you're doing. What are some of the challenges to getting people to thinking about a world that isn't reliant on police, and how do we move in that direction?
So that it sounds like those are two questions. One, what are some examples of the organizations that we work with that are delivering care to individuals in real time? And secondly, what sort of environment do we live in that, what are the difficulties and barriers, behind changing our perspective as to how we negotiate conflict? First, I'll start with the second question. What are some of the barriers that create the difficulty behind negotiating our conflict differently? Again, I'll point to our data. Again, for the first 4 years of Raheem, we were the independent service for reporting police. During that time, we learned a lot. We ultimately learned that cops don't keep us safe, but also that we have to do everything we can to avoid leveraging police as a means of negotiating our conflict. And here's why. We found a positive correlation with the presence of police and violence as a means of negotiating intramural conflict. What we had noticed is that not just police violence, right? So you're talking to a person who believes that the presence of police is police violence. So from that lens, it is still police violence, but even just the presence of police who in their day-to-day negotiate conflict using means of violence. They are problem solvers with their weapons. That's their claim to fame. We solve your problems by bringing our violence to the scene. And we get things under control. We are the people who you depend on to protect you, right? That protection comes with great sacrifice to the American people. Even when we don't know it. And so what we recognized, back to my point, what we recognized was the presence of police negotiating that conflict with violence, as armed individuals. We noticed that community members were receiving that as an activity and as a perfect example in the ways with which they themselves should negotiate their own intramural conflict. So we found that when community members looked at police negotiate their conflict and our societal conflict with acts of violence, it is a learned behavior that community members also have used that as a means of, have leveraged that violence as a means of negotiating their own conflict. Let me put that into perspective. It means, therefore, if this is true, and if the correlation is a causation, and there is something, again, we sunsetted the service, and so we haven't necessarily done the in-depth research around this area, but I think that this makes sense for us, because if community members regularly see an example of how to negotiate their own conflict by watching the state negotiate their very conflict, again, even when that conflict is caused by the state itself, right? Lack of quality, affordable housing, lack of mental health care or any medical care, right? These are all the sort of concerns and structural violence mechanisms that exist because there's a lack of care and infrastructure for communities, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so as a result, what we have seen is communities have learned by the state that the best way and the best means of negotiating their own conflict is with acts of violence. And so I think that makes it incredibly difficult to depend on police to negotiate our conflict regularly is a practice that is a learned behavior. And it's being taught over and over and over and over and over again every time a police officer shows themselves on the scene. And so that's a structural barrier that makes it difficult to reimagine what it may look like to solve our problems differently, but especially without acts of violence.
I know I asked you the other question about the organizations, but I did want to, I had mentioned that this man from DC was killed in Fairfax County outside of a shopping mall as a result of an incident where the loss prevention police, or whatever they're called, security at the mall, said stole designer sunglasses. So ultimately, a man lost his life, and a family is grieving, and children will grow up without a father because of some property issue. And I was thinking about what you're saying about how police that is, I hadn't really thought about it exactly like that. The violence of the state is really clear in some ways to some people, and some people don't see it. But that they're teaching us to negotiate with violence. But also, I wonder if you want to say anything about how we set up property loss as more important than at least some lives. I am not sure that a young white person would be shot to death outside Tyson's Corner Mall. Maybe I'm wrong, but we set up property, a pair of sunglasses, over an individual's life. So how does property play into this?
I think that's just an excuse to shoot Black people. I mean, I come on, designer sunglasses. There's the amount of money we spend in dispatching police alone outweigh the amount of money that the loss prevention staff are enforcing. And also, again, we're talking about designer sunglasses, and this is a trend. This isn't something that just up and happened. Like, this is a trend across the country. Like, Black people are killed as a result of being Black, not because they stole designer sunglasses. Stealing designer sunglasses is just sort of like, oh, we have a good reason to do this. But I don't know any person I just don't know any person who would elect for their children, their siblings, their mother, their father, their uncle, their cousins, to live in a world where conflict is negotiated by that level of violence. I don't care how hard ass you are. It's not something that you would elect to do. So I honestly think Cleve brought it, like this also happened in New York. I mean, didn't he steal a backpack, and it was just like
yep, and couldn't afford
to bail, and it ended up staying in prison in Rikers Island for years, and then finally got out and committed suicide. These are like, there are stories about how the state has targeted Black people, and I sometimes struggle to come up with a good reason why Black people are targeted when it involves anything. But honestly, I keep going around to it that there are just things that Black people cannot do that white people do often, but because we are Black, it is a death sentence. And just like you said, they would have never shot a white woman outside of a store holding a pair of designer sunglasses. It would have never. Show me the story where that has happened. Like, it just doesn't. It just has not happened, or at least I haven't read about it. And so I think that that's just an excuse to shoot Black people. And again, it's also that it is not out of the ordinary for police to shoot people. It may be out of the ordinary for us. it may be out of the ordinary for us. I mean, it ain't for me. I know police shoot people, especially people of color, all day. But I think that it's not out of the ordinary for cops who, on a day-to-day basis, are taught. This is what they are taught. They aren't taught to say to de-escalate. They aren't taught to negotiate and problem solve uh, by providing the care that and support that that community member needs. And yeah, so there's that. Also, it it's not lost on me that that man lost his life because of a pair of designer sunglasses that I'm assuming if he stole them, then he couldn't afford to buy them. And I have to wonder, what does it mean to live in a society where we also can't afford basic stuff, because
Mm.
people have also been shot and killed for much less than designer sunglasses. I mean, I saw a video just not long ago about a woman who found a $50 bill on the floor of a convenience store, and they put her in a chokehold as she was leaving. Said the money didn't belong there. It was a 50-something-year-old black grandmother. And so I just think it's a practice of the lack of compassion. And compassion is not a topic or a subject that's taught to police officers. It's sort of not their job to hold compassion for the lives of the people they kill. It's a dissonance. It has to. Come on, you spend most of your day killing people in various ways, not just shooting them. And communities spend most of their lives living in open air prisons. And you're telling me there's no way that cops are holding a level of compassion necessary for creating the sort of safety community members need.
And you mentioned at the top of the hour that your organization is named for compassion, right?
Yes.
And partly we live in a state that promotes violence rather than compassion. How do we? I mean, I went into this conversation thinking we talk about how to organize to get people.
That's okay.
But now I'm just thinking, we have so much work to do to change people's mindsets, and everything outside is always like kind of pressing them back into the box or back into the it's happening in DC now, where we passed a revised criminal code for the first time in 100 years, revised the whole thing. And that was enough of a battle. And lots of people, went through, and see, I use the word battle, like we have violence as our language. And, now there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction to, well, we have to get rid of that because you're going to let criminals off, and the only way to stop them is to hurt them. And as though criminals were a identifiable subset of our society, which, listening to you speak, I'm thinking, as much as, well, DC is still dealing with, as is the rest of the country, with the idea that we have to use different language, but we're still trying to kill Black people.
And criminalization is manufactured by the state. Like, criminalization is fake. Like, it's fake. Like, that's not real. Because if we had anything I'll tell you about criminalization. I served in the U.S. Army for 5 years. I did 2 tours in Iraq. On my first tour, I was heading in a convoy from Kuwait to Iraq. You can't fly into Iraq for obvious reasons. Also, I'm not very happy about being in the Army for a lot of reasons, so I don't mention it a lot, but I think in this story it makes sense. I was in a Humvee with 3 other people. It was 4 of us. I was in the back seat. My first line supervisor was in the front. We're passing by. To the right of me, my window's up. There are kids as we are driving by. There's one kid who doesn't have an arm. He's an amputee. He has no arm. and he has an empty water bottle. It was crushed. Uh, there's ash around his mouth. You could tell that this kid was thirsty, just wants some water. I'm sitting in a Humvee, uh, you know, with a box of bottled water. I go to reach for a bottled water, and my first line supervisor says, "You don't give that out. That's our water, and we are told not to give out water to the young kids that are running alongside this Humvee." I knew then we weren't. I certainly knew then. I probably knew sometime before, but I knew then that I was not there to create safety, because that's not safety. Safety is safety would have been giving that person water. Safety would have been providing that person with his basic needs. And I think you can't ask people to perform anything without creating. So I don't think that we can actually. I guess I don't think that we can actually create safety without providing individuals with their basic needs. And so the manufacturing of criminalization is both narcissistic and ironic, considering that the state leverages violence all day across this globe to solve its problems, and then comes back to this state, comes back to communities that don't have running water. If they do, that don't have running water, that don't have access to affordable health care, that don't have quality affordable housing, that don't have food, that don't have access to clean anything. And so I'm thinking, if you're telling me that like this state performs violence on a day-to-day basis to negotiate conflict across the world by killing innocent lives, especially people of color across the globe, and then coming back to the state and saying, "Oh, hey, we're also don't have any money to provide you with the sort of basic infrastructure necessary to live your life, while we ask you to cooperate in an economy that's failing because we haven't provided you with the basic needs that you need." I think that's a manufacturing of criminalization, especially if they're not willing to name, if the state is unwilling to name itself as a criminal in this cog. So I think it's fake, and so I think criminalization is manufactured by the state, and you can't talk about the criminalization of any one person in this country again without talking about the criminalization, the criminal activity, and without naming the criminal activity that the state takes part in, leads, spearheads, and manufactures on a day-by-day basis, not just in this country, but in dozens of countries across the globe.
So that again is the voice of Brandon Anderson, who is founder and executive director of the Oakland-based national organization Raheem. This is We Act Radio. I'm Virginia Avniel Spatz, and this is Conversations Toward Repair. So we've been talking about some of the underlying or overlying or surrounding us issues, but I do want to make sure before you have to leave that we do talk about Raheem itself and how people can get involved. Should they get involved on the national level or find a local organization? How would you say they should engage?
Good question. I think the best way for individuals to become involved in Raheem is to join the Patch Network. And Patch Network is People in Technology for Community Health. Again, it's that network of 60 plus mobile crisis teams, health and social services, and abolitionist organizations that are either managing or interested in establishing community crisis response teams, or CCRTs. As individuals join the Patch Network, we meet regularly once a quarter, and when you join, you're able to connect to the local community crisis response teams in your local area. If one doesn't exist, you can create it. And when you join our network, that's exactly what we help you do. Our goal is to help grow and expand operational and technical capacity of community crisis response teams. And and that starts with regular, ordinary people who are tired of depending on police to protect their communities, aka commit acts of violence. And so that is, I'd say that's the best way to get involved.
So I put on the screen for those who are able to see, Raheem, RAHEEM.org. And that is that the right portal for joining up with the Patch Network?
Yes. So when you go to Raheem.org, you'll see that the Patch Network, there's a space there to get involved. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I will put all of these links up on weactradio.blog. We're using the .blog at the moment because the .com is having its own technological problems. And I do encourage people to learn more about that work and to hook up with Raheem or the Patch Network, and maybe create a local organization. We talked at the very beginning about technology and organizing as two kinds of infrastructure. So if you're in a community where there isn't anybody that you can identify who's working on these issues, how does Raheem or like joining up with this quarterly meetings, how else can you get support?
So I think the major concerns of building a CCRT are around community crisis response team. This is generally the process, is first to understand what sort of concerns in your community exist. And a needs assessment is generally the first step I would recommend, and we can help you we can support in performing that needs assessment, but a simple investigation of the calls to 911. So researching and understanding what are the reasons people are calling 911 in your particular area. Let's say, for instance, in Washington, D.C., there are 500,000 calls a year, and 50% of those calls have something to do with individuals who live homeless, without a home, because of, again, the structural violence of not allowing or not having enough affordable quality housing for community members. Then you may want your crisis response team to be able to support individuals who live without homes, right? And one example of that in Denver is the Denver Alliance for Street Response, Street Health Response, or DASHR. And in Denver, or with DASHR, street medics, or action medics that they call it, are like volunteers with varying degrees of medical training who help provide medical care, like first aid in situations frequently neglected by traditional institutions, but especially the police. And so if you're in a city where a local community crisis response team has not been built, I think it's exciting. I think it's an opportunity for individuals to bring a group together to create that. And I think Raheem and the Patch Network is a great place to start to get support. You'll be able to, the support you'll receive is, of course, tools. So you can, I'll start first with trainings. We're launching an accredited training program next year, starting first with liberated dispatcher training. We train dispatchers or call takers on how to de-escalate conflict over the phone. And the other that we provide for people are sort of tools around technology, right? So once you have a community crisis response team semi up and running, you may want to understand how best to dispatch and coordinate personnel, whether they be volunteers or paid staff. So when you get started, you can onboard to our Patch software. And that software is essentially, it's an alternative dispatching system to 911. Right now, when you call 911, the dispatcher on the other end, generally a regional or local dispatcher, will route or call on sort of their consortium of care, if that makes sense. And in this country, the consortium of care includes fire, EMS, and the police. But in most locales, 88% of the time, dispatchers are dispatching police. However, less than 3% of calls involve serious violence and require, I don't think anything requires police, but even if you thought it required police, it's only really about 3% of the time. But the idea here is to have a system, a dispatching system, so that communities don't have to depend on 911. And so when they receive requests for care from their community, we help them dispatch and coordinate those caregivers in real time. And then I'll finish up with the last thing here very soon. I want to say we'll launch the application in a couple of months, but we also help community crisis response teams, or CCRTs, expand their capacity through our Liberated Dispatcher Training course, but also a toolkit designed to help emerging CCRTs navigate common challenges. And to help organizations fully leverage these trainings, we support crisis response fellows who work 3 to 4 days per week at their host community crisis response team. There, they help sort of implement best practices and provide care to community members directly, essentially expanding the operational capacity of the organization or the CCRT. And then the other 1 to 2 days a week, fellows work with Raheem to co-design the next iterations of our training curriculum. And this feedback loop ensures that we're sort of offering a network of our network of CCRTs, high quality support that's grounded in applied research.
And so those the individuals you just mentioned, they're paid
They're paid for 6 months. They are paid $40,000 over 6 months. And we're launching, and our inaugural fellowship starts in the first week of July. First week of July of this year, 2023, and the applications will open sometime in March or April.
Okay, so listeners can apply themselves or share that information, and we'll link that from our website as well. And it did occur to me that, well, any work requires money, but that's going to require money. So do you have like a membership structure or donors, or how do people, if they wanted to support, how would they do?
If they want to give us money, we'll take money in any way you want to give it. We'll take PayPal, ACH transfer. No, I'm joking, but not really. I mean, you're right. This work requires dollars. The infrastructure for community crisis response teams, we think, is valuable and significant, incredibly important for supporting community crisis response teams. But we can't do it without the support of, without funding. And so I absolutely think that listeners and friends, colleagues, I mean, we're a nonprofit, so a lot of our work is done through donations. So any amount will help.
And this is probably too wild an idea, but is there any thought of trying to get some of the money that various jurisdictions currently spend on a more violent response redirected, like toward these individual, like the Dasher work, for example?
Yeah. Do I have faith that State and local governments will divest and divert money from active policing into the hands of trained, unarmed community members to respond to crises carte blanche? No, I don't. I don't have very much faith in that. I don't have very much faith in that because, I mean, even the first 13 cities that voted to divest from some of the money from policing and invest in alternatives have sort of withered away post 2020. 2020 was the year people said, you know, Black people mattered a lot. As we gotten further away from that year, Black people have mattered less and less. And so I think if I'm putting my strategy cap on, right? And some people might agree with this, some people might not, but one thing that I forgot what, I think I got this, when did I hear that? I think it's Ruth Gilmore, and she said, I'm trying to think of the quote she said. Oh, maybe I can find it. Yeah, anyway.
So while you're looking for that, I will just tell listeners, Ruth Gilmore, you can learn, there's lots of things online, and she wrote a book called Abolitionist Geography that you should read.
Yes.
So.
Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And the best way to describe this is, think of a garden. A garden, in order to grow, I'm not a good gardener. One of my good friends in Washington, D.C., Dr. Romano, good friend of mine, let me stay in his house when I was in between places, which happened a lot when I lived in DC, actually. Probably happened to a lot of Black folk who've been displaced in DC. But he was like, you know, how about you, tend to my garden while I'm out of town? Really just a good way to, make me feel good about needing a place to stay. But one thing I learned through my stint of gardening there is that gardening is a tough job, right? There's a lot of stuff you need to do in order to keep a garden healthy. And we were growing, food especially. So some of the things I learned I had to do, I had to water it, I had to make sure it had plenty of sun. I had to tend to it and give it, if it was plants that needed food, I did that. If it was fertilizer or turning the soil, but also pulling weeds, right? Because weeds would kind of get in the way of growth of everything else. But pulling weeds was just a part of my experience gardening. It wasn't the only part. And in fact, it was, if I'm thinking about it, it was the least part I found the most enjoyable or had the greatest impact. What I found is that gardening was about doing it. It was about cultivating the good of the garden. It did include also pulling out what was not good for the garden. It also included mostly doing what was good for the garden. And I think Ruth Gilmore in her quote really hits on that. It's not only about absence. Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. So I think that one of the strategies that abolitionists could learn from is a gardening strategy, one that centers the solution of community crisis response, even without, even if you don't believe in the solution. Even if you don't believe in why we're doing it, right? We want to do this because we want to get police out of our community. You could say that, but honestly, it's because we want to provide the safety that community members need. We know police don't do that, but we should also be thinking as strategic abolitionists, visionaries on what would it take to create the environment necessary for communities to be safe and to thrive in their garden. And sometimes that includes removing police. It should all the time include removing police, but in an environment where that is difficult, where pulling that weed out, pulling those weeds just they just keep coming back. It's a constant thing. And so we're always going to have to do the pulling the weeds. We shouldn't get stuck in pulling the weeds, though. We should also spend our time nurturing the garden, creating community safety outside of policing is a fundamental principle of building life-affirming institutions as an abolitionist. And abolition has to therefore be about building, not only removing, or not only about pulling the weeds, so to speak.
Well, that seems like a wonderful note to end on. I realize you've already stayed a little bit longer than we had scheduled. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I'd love to follow up, with more about what Raheem is doing. And thank you so much for taking this time to talk about these important issues. As I said, the conversation didn't quite go where I, had planned, but
it was fine.
Good. I am very glad to hear that. And I will remind people you've been listening to Brandon Anderson, who is founder and executive director of Raheem, which you can find at Raheem, RAHEEM.org. And I have a few announcements, but I'm going to let Brandon Anderson take off and carry on the work, and let me give some announcements and say thank you so much for this. This has been a very great conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you.
So as I said, I do have a couple of announcements before we close out this time. I want to make sure that people know there is another book talk scheduled for We Act Radio's co-founder, Kimon Freeman. His book, Nineveh, Conflict Over Water, is going to be published at the end of this month. And there's one more book talk on his tour scheduled for this coming Sunday, March 5th, 6:30 to 8 o'clock at the Busboys and Poets in Baltimore. And you can find a link to that event at either ninevehnovel.com, and I'm going to put that on the screen for those who have access to it, NINEVEH novel.com, ninevehnovel.com, or you can find that from weactradio.blog, .blog, where our current information is posted. So that book talk is coming up, and the book is to be released. You can pre-order and get a signed copy at various locations starting on, I believe the date is March 22nd. And I also want to let listeners know that next week, my guest will be Kristen Henning, who is an author, a public defender, and a professor of law. She wrote a book called The Rage of Innocence, which I highly, highly recommend. The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And she will be joining our show next week to talk about the book and the concept of adolescence and teen experiences, and how our country has racialized the idea of teenagehood so that some people are punished for being young and some people are given a great deal of indulgence. So that's March 8th on Conversations Toward Repair. And I also want to let people know that there is a GoFundMe for the family of Timothy Johnson. And I'll link that from weactradio.blog, but you can also probably find it independently. It is run by the NAACP in Fairfax County, who have made a statement saying, unfortunately, Timothy Johnson's story is all too familiar. An encounter with the police ends in death. Tim was an avid creative spirit. He loved to design clothes and tennis shoes. He was also learning to cut hair and planned to work as a barber. He adored his 2 children. Tim wasn't perfect. He suffered from personal demons and mental health issues, but Tim certainly didn't deserve to die over sunglasses stolen from a department store. Please help Tim's family with burial expenses and offer financial support for the 2 children who the 12-year-old and 9-year-old left behind. All funds will go to Melissa Johnson, who is Tim's mother. So that is a statement from Michelle Leete of the president of Fairfax County NAACP, and you should check that out if you are able to support that family. And there is going to be more information. As always, I put on our website links to the various organizations and information that was discussed in this show. So you'll find a link to Rahim, to the Patch Network that was discussed. You can find a link to apply for the training that Brandon Anderson said would be coming up in July, and applications will open up in a few weeks, I believe. And the Rahim website has information linking these various groups. As he said, there are 60 of them that are all over the country, and you can find an organization there to join with, or as described, you can find tools for setting up your own organization. And I can't say enough, you should check out rahim.org. You should also, if you are able, look at the NAACP of Fairfax GoFundMe for Timothy McCree Johnson, who was killed by Fairfax County Police last week. I don't have much more information about the other 2 incidents. There are some reporters in DC who are following up on the incident in which Savante Doty Perkins was apparently killed himself after an exchange of gunfire with our local MPD, and U.S. Marshals killed a man yesterday. As of the beginning of this broadcast, I still didn't have that man's name, but you can find information about that through weactradio.blog and many other locations. And so with that, I will say this is Virginia Avniel Spatz for Conversations Toward Repair on We Act Radio. Wishing you a good week until we come together again on March 8th. Peace.